The rain had been falling steadily for hours, soaking the crumbling city of Whitlow in an eerie silence. A silence that hadn't existed in years. For the first time since the outbreak, the undead were gone, or so they believed. After 6 long years of terror, humanity had won. That's what the officials said. That's what the survivors wanted to believe. Whitlow was one of the few cities left standing, its streets barricaded, its buildings fortified, and its people trained to defend themselves. It had become a symbol of survival. Families began to settle again. Children played in guarded parks. Traders reopened storefronts beneath solar-powered lights. Life was beginning to feel normal. Among the many who had fought to reclaim this peace was Mason Trask, a former firefighter turned militia leader. At 39, Mason bore scars from battles both seen and unseen. He had led dozens of rescue missions, buried friends, and faced the gnashing jaws of the undead up close more times than he could count. He didn't trust peace. Not entirely. "There's something wrong," he murmured to Elena Ruiz, the town's head of communications, as they stood watching the main gate being lowered for a convoy returning from the outer farms. Elena glanced at him, brow furrowed. "You say that every time a quiet day rolls by." "No birds," he said. "No scavengers. And we haven't had a horde sighting in over 3 months. That's a good thing. Not when it's unnatural." Despite his instincts, Mason had no evidence. And Whitlow wasn't ready for paranoia, not now. Still, he made a mental note to double-check the patrol schedules. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Miles away, near the edge of the dead zones, a forgotten CDC research outpost blinked back to life. Its emergency lights flickered as a backup generator hummed. Inside, broken monitors glowed faintly. On one of the screens, camera feeds showed twisted shapes moving through heavy fog. Not aimless like the infected of old, but organized, as if they hunted with purpose. A motion alert triggered a silent ping. Far beneath the outpost, something stirred. Back in Whitlow, 20-year-old Liam Miles, one of the city's new scout recruits, was on his first solo recon mission. Eager to prove himself, he ignored the usual path and veered deeper into the uncharted woods. He found an old shack near the river, a place locals had once used for fishing before the outbreak. The door hung loose on one hinge. A strange stench drifted from inside. He tapped his radio. "Base, I found a structure west of Zone 7. Could be worth checking out." "Copy that, Scout Miles. Be careful." "Don't engage," the voice crackled back. But Liam was young. Curious. And inside that shack, beneath a tarp, he found something that made his blood run cold, a makeshift operating table, splattered with dried blood and chains bolted to the floor. The walls were covered in pinned photographs and sketches of skeletal humanoids with strange markings on their skulls. Liam turned to leave, and saw movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Pale. Rotten. But faster than any walker he'd seen before. Its eyes glowed faintly amber. It didn't groan, it snarled. He ran. His screams over the radio cut off just as the static took over. Mason heard it. So did Elena. Within minutes, a 4-man team was mobilized, and Mason led them into the woods. What they found was Liam's rifle, snapped in half, and claw marks embedded deep into nearby trees. No body. No tracks. "They're evolving," Mason whispered. Elena didn't argue. Back in Whitlow, the city's main screen lit up with an emergency broadcast from the outer settlements. Grainy footage played, a barn being overrun by creatures not quite human. Their limbs were longer. Their coordination, precise. They didn't stumble. They climbed. One leapt through a second-story window like a predator. "Unknown variant," the broadcast host said, voice trembling. "This isn't the infection we fought before." Then the feed went dead. Panic began to ripple through Whitlow. Families packed their bags. Defense teams doubled up on wall patrols. For the first time in months, the fear returned. But Mason didn't panic. He planned. If they've changed, he said, so must we. Above them, storm clouds gathered. And just beyond the hills, the undead marched again, not as monsters, but as a force. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far worse. The fog rolled in just before dawn, thick and unnatural. It clung to Whitlow like a shroud, muffling sound and cloaking sight. Visibility dropped to a few feet, and the scent of damp earth mixed with something else, something old, metallic, and wrong. Mason Trask stood atop the north wall with binoculars clutched tightly in gloved hands. He scanned the nothingness, hoping to catch any sign of Liam. But only the gray wall of mist stared back. A deep, lingering unease clawed at him. "They're watching us," he muttered. Elena Ruiz stood beside him, arms folded. "The mist is messing with your head." Mason lowered the binoculars. Liam was fast. Trained. And he vanished without a sound. We didn't even find blood. Something took him, clean. Below them, the town stirred. Defense teams suited up in layers of scavenged gear. Generators hummed to life. The sense of peace had vanished, replaced by tension so thick it felt like another kind of fog pressing in on everyone. A new patrol unit was formed, 6 volunteers trained to scout the immediate perimeter. Among them was Nadia Blake, a survivalist who'd once lived alone in the forest for nearly a year. She had sharp eyes, faster instincts, and didn't believe in coincidence. She tightened the straps on her backpack and said to Mason, "I don't like this. Fog this thick doesn't sit right." "Just find out what's out there," Mason told her. "If you see anything strange, fall back. Don't engage." As the team slipped out through the west gate, their figures were quickly swallowed by the mist. Radio chatter remained steady at first, Nadia's calm voice giving updates every few minutes. Then came a sudden, bone-chilling whisper across the channel. Not a report. Not even human. Just a low growl, followed by a screech of static. All radios went dead at once. Mason's jaw tightened. "Pull them back. Now." Runners were dispatched to retrieve the patrol, but one came back limping, face pale and eyes wide. Cole Avery, the youngest on the team. "They were waiting for us," he gasped. "They set a trap." Mason steadied him. "What do you mean?" "They herded us like animals." One of them mimicked Nadia's voice over the comms. "Drew us in. We walked right into them." Elena's breath caught. "They're smart." Cole nodded, his voice shaking. "They didn't act like the undead. They moved with purpose, coordination. And one of them, it looked at me. It knew I was afraid." Of the 6, only Cole returned. Nadia was gone. That night, panic began to seep through the town like the fog itself. The people of Whitlow had lived through horror, but this was different. Before, the infected were mindless. Predictable. You could outsmart them. Outrun them. Fight them. But now, the enemy had changed. Mason convened a meeting of senior survivors in the old city hall, a relic of the time before. Maps were spread on the table. Red markers showed the dead zones. Blue circles marked areas recently patrolled. The new threat, whatever it was, seemed to be moving in calculated patterns. "They're not just attacking," Mason said. "They're reconning. Testing our defenses. Looking for weak points." Elena rubbed her temples. "But how? They shouldn't even be capable of higher thought." "Maybe this is something new," said Dr. Harrow, a former biochemist who'd worked with the CDC. "Something spliced. Engineered." Mason leaned forward. "Explain." Dr. Harrow hesitated. "Before everything fell, we received word of a strain, an experimental virus derived from the original infection. Designed to accelerate evolution in the undead for possible military applications. It was supposed to be destroyed when the labs were shut down. But if it survived..." Elena finished his sentence. "Then we're not fighting a virus anymore. We're fighting something that's learning." At that moment, the power flickered. The backup generator kicked in, but only partially. Half the town lost light. Panic spread like wildfire. Mason ran to the gatehouse. A figure was approaching from the fog. He raised his rifle, but paused. It was Nadia. She was limping. Bloody. But alive. The gates opened, and she collapsed into Mason's arms. Her eyes were wild, her skin pale, but she was conscious. "They let me go," she whispered. Mason froze. "What?" "They surrounded me. But didn't kill me." One of them, it leaned in and whispered something. Everyone leaned closer. She spoke in a trembling voice. It said, "We remember you." The room fell silent. The fog thickened again outside the walls. Whitlow wasn't just being hunted. It was being studied. And the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Mason didn't sleep that night. Neither did anyone else in Whitlow. After Nadia was carried inside and her wounds were treated, she slipped into a deep, uneasy sleep. The medics checked her vitals, normal. No fever. No bite. But her eyes twitched constantly behind closed lids, like she was reliving something over and over. Elena paced the command room. They whispered to her. They let her go. Why? Mason didn't answer right away. He was looking at the map again, this time drawing out new patterns with string and nails. They're marking us somehow. Picking their targets. Testing the ones who fight. Watching how we respond. That's not how this works, she said sharply. Zombies don't plan. They don't negotiate. They don't remember. Mason tapped the string running through Whitlow and 4 other fallen towns. Then maybe these aren't just zombies anymore. Downstairs, Nadia woke up screaming. A medic ran in, followed by Elena and Mason. Her face was drenched in sweat. Her hands trembled as she sat up. It wasn't a dream, she said. It spoke to me. Not just random words, full thoughts. It knew who I was. It said my name. Elena knelt beside her. Do you remember anything else? Nadia nodded slowly. There was one, different from the others. Tall. Half its skull was missing, but it didn't move like it was broken. It stood perfectly straight. It wore a jacket, military style. And it had a symbol stitched into the collar. CDC. Mason stiffened. You're sure? I'm sure, she whispered. And it said something else before I passed out. It said, you were there when we were born. They all looked at each other. Whitlow wasn't just under threat, it was part of something bigger. Something connected to the early days of the outbreak. And someone, or something, was remembering. By mid-morning, Mason had made up his mind. We're going to the outpost, he said. The one Liam found. If the dead are acting smarter, more coordinated, then that site may hold answers. You're walking into a trap, Elena warned. Maybe, he said. But if we sit here doing nothing, the next whisper won't come through the fog. It'll be in the middle of town. He picked a small team, 4 of the most experienced scouts, including Jared Kane, a grizzled ex-cop with a prosthetic leg, and June Harper, an explosives expert who never went anywhere without her handmade booby traps. They left just after noon, heading west into the woods. The fog still clung low to the trees, but it was thinning. That didn't make it better, just quieter. 3 hours in, they found what was left of the old CDC outpost. Half buried in vines and rust, it looked more like a tomb than a research facility. The front door was dented and warped, as if something had forced its way in, or out. Inside, the smell hit them first, mold, chemicals, rot. The power was out, but June lit up a lantern and handed out masks. We do this fast, Mason said. Grab files, backup drives, anything with data. Don't touch anything that bleeds. They split into pairs and moved through the narrow corridors. Rooms were overturned, paper scattered everywhere. Blood smeared the walls and long, deliberate handprints. Jared found a recording device near a control panel. He handed it to Mason and said, "You'll want to hear this." Mason pressed play. The voice was cracked and panicked. "A man. This is Dr. Evan Kessler. Experiment 12A has breached quarantine. Subjects are no longer responding to sedatives. They're adapting, mimicking behavior. One spoke today. It said, 'Help me.' That's not a survival instinct. That's memory. They're remembering who they were, what was done to them." The audio ended with the sound of screaming and metal crashing. June stepped into the hallway, holding a scorched file folder. "I found this in the incinerator. Someone tried to burn it before they left." Mason flipped it open. Inside were documents stamped classified, Genome Recoding Initiative. One page stood out, a photo of 5 infected subjects, each with minor surgical implants visible through exposed flesh. One of them wore a military jacket. Nadia was right. Mason's voice was tight. They were part of some early test group. Survivors from a previous outbreak, used as human subjects. They weren't killed. They were converted. Just then, a soft creak echoed through the building. Jared raised his gun. "We've got movement." The team fell silent, weapons up, backs to the wall. Down the hall, a figure emerged slowly from the shadows. Its eyes gleamed faintly gold in the dim light. No moaning. No snarling. Just calm, calculated steps. Mason's finger hovered over the trigger. The figure raised its hand, and spoke. "Mason Trask. You left us behind." The hallway exploded into chaos. Bullets fired. Lights burst. The fog outside rushed in like a living thing. They barely made it out alive. But as they ran, Mason knew one thing for sure. The undead weren't just back. They wanted revenge. The forest seemed to close in behind them as Mason's team raced back toward Whitlow, lungs burning, legs aching, the sound of the undead's footsteps echoing just beyond the trees. They hadn't spoken since they escaped the outpost. No one needed to. They all heard it. The voice. The accusation. "You left us behind." It wasn't just a threat. It was personal. By the time they reached Whitlow's gates, the sun was dipping low, casting the sky in blood-orange hues. The guards opened the gate just long enough to let the team stumble through before slamming it shut again. Mason dropped to his knees, gasping. Elena rushed to him, her eyes wide. "What happened?" "They spoke to us," June panted. They knew his name. They were waiting. Jared tossed the scorched file folder onto the nearest table. "There's more. Files. Recordings. This isn't a new outbreak. These things were made. Weaponized. They were once like us, maybe even with memories of who they used to be." Inside the command center, the room fell into stunned silence as Mason relayed every detail, the classified documents, the mutated infected, the one who spoke his name. "They're not attacking randomly anymore," he said. "They're coming for us. Me. Anyone connected to the first days of the outbreak." "But why now?" Elena asked. Dr. Harrow, who had been quietly going through the files, spoke up. "Because something woke them up. Maybe a signal. A failsafe. Or maybe, they've simply evolved far enough to remember. They're not just trying to destroy Whitlow," June said grimly. "They're trying to punish it." Elena paced the room. "We need to make a public statement. Let the people know what's coming." "No," Mason said. "If we panic them now, we lose control. We need to prepare, quietly. Reinforce the gates. Double the night watch. Set traps beyond the perimeter." "And when they come?" Elena asked. Mason's eyes were cold. "We don't wait this time. We go to them." That night, the fog crept in again. High atop Whitlow's bell tower, a lone sniper named Arlo kept watch with night vision goggles. He'd been on every major defense line since the fall. His trigger finger was steady. His nerves, steel. But even Arlo didn't expect what he saw next. Movement in the mist. Not one figure, but 20. Then 30. Then more. Silent. Coordinated. Marching in rows like soldiers. He pressed his comm. This is Tower 1. I've got eyes on something. East wall. Full formation. Then he stopped. The leading figure stepped into the moonlight and saluted. Not a wave. Not a lunge. A crisp, deliberate salute. Arlo's voice broke. They know we're watching. By the time Mason arrived at the tower, the figures had vanished back into the trees. Not one gun had been fired. Not one groan was heard. Just the sound of leaves crunching under disciplined feet. They're taunting us now, Arlo said. No, Mason replied, jaw tight. They're warning us. The next day, the town began quiet fortifications. Traps were laid, tripwires, pressure mines, and electrified fences along the outer zones. Archer nests were built into rooftops. Every able-bodied adult was given a weapon and a position. All while Mason, Elena, and Harrow searched the files for anything they could use. And then they found it. Tucked inside a rusted hard drive, buried beneath corrupted folders, was a single video file. Date, 6 years ago. Location, Outpost 9B. The footage began with lab workers in hazmat suits dragging restrained, infected humans into steel chambers. 5 of them. One with a missing eye. One with a shattered leg. One in a military jacket. Subjects 12A through 12E, the voice said. Former civilians and 1 soldier. No known family. No external contact for weeks. Initiating cognitive enhancement trials. Elena's voice cracked. They were testing on them. The video showed injections, surgical implants, brain scans. Then something worse. A group of scientists in suits, clapping. They wanted them to think, Dr. Harrow whispered. They tried to make them into weapons with memory, with logic. They believed if they could control that, they could win the war. Mason stared at the paused video. But they lost control. And buried the evidence. And now the subjects are back, Elena said. And they remember everything. Outside the gates, the fog was thicker than ever. That evening, a child named Ember, barely 10, ran to the town square screaming. There's something in the well. A crowd gathered. Inside the stone well, dangling from a rope, was a human arm, severed, but fresh. Wrapped around the wrist was a rusted chain. Etched into the skin in jagged ink, we remember. Whitlow was no longer just surviving. It was being haunted. The severed arm in the well changed everything. Whitlow, once a symbol of survival and recovery, now felt like a cage with walls too thin to matter. Everyone had seen the arm. The word carved into its flesh. We remember. No one could explain how it had been lowered into the town's most guarded space without triggering alarms. Fear now crept in like the fog, slow, thick, unstoppable. Mason Trask stood at the edge of the square, watching as a team of medics carefully removed the arm and sealed it in a quarantine case. The crowd was silent. Even the children didn't cry. The message had been received. They never left, Mason said under his breath. They've been here. Waiting. Elena Ruiz joined him, her face pale. We checked every inch of the well system last winter. No breaches. No tunnels. It was sealed. Then they found another way in. At the command center, Dr. Harrow pulled up the remaining files they had salvaged from the CDC outpost. One caught Mason's eye, a blurry photograph of subject 12C. The file had no name, only a number. But the eyes in the photo. They were human. Alert. Angry. Mason remembered them. He'd seen them once, early in the outbreak, on a rescue mission in New Denver. A group of civilians had been flagged for extraction, but by the time Mason's team arrived, they were already quarantined by the military. One man fought back, screaming that they weren't sick, that the symptoms were side effects of the treatment they'd been forced to take. "I left them behind," Mason whispered. "What?" Mason looked up. Subject 12C. "I was there. I saw him. I could have done something. But we were ordered to stand down." Elena nodded slowly. "Now they're standing up." That evening, as the town locked down for the night, Mason met with his inner circle: Elena, Dr. Harrow, Jared, June, and Arlo. "We need to assume Whitlow is compromised," Mason said. "They've been inside the walls already." "The arm proves it." "Could be a warning," Arlo muttered. "It is," June replied. "But the next one won't be." Mason laid out a new plan, bold, desperate. "We send out a distraction unit, draw their attention beyond the city limits. While they're focused outward, a second team heads to Site R-17. "The old weapons cache?" Jared asked. Mason nodded. "If there's anything left, we'll need it. We can't win this with rifles and fences. We need something heavier. Something that makes them think twice." "What if they don't think twice?" Elena asked. "What if they want us to find that site?" Mason looked at her. "Then we go anyway. Because sitting here is a slow death." At dawn, the two teams moved out. Jared and June led the decoy squad, lighting signal fires, setting off small explosive charges, creating chaos across the tree lanes to lure the enemy away. Meanwhile, Mason, Elena, and Arlo made their way south towards Site R-17, a hidden underground military depot built into the hills before the fall. They traveled light, quiet, careful not to leave a trail. The forest was silent. Too silent. No birds, no insects. Just the wind through dead branches and the occasional rustle that made hearts stop. When they reached the outer edge of Site R-17, Mason froze. The steel entrance was already open. Someone had been there. Or still was. They descended into the dark tunnels, flashlights flickering against cold metal walls. The air was stale. The dust thick. And yet, footprints marked the floor. Not drag marks, footprints. Human-like. Recent. They followed them deeper until they reached the armory. Half the crates were broken open. Rocket launchers, armor, and targeting systems stripped clean. "They've been building an arsenal," Arlo whispered. "But who?" As if in answer, a voice crackled through an ancient intercom system, one no longer connected to Whitlow. "Hello, Mason." It was calm. Too calm. "I hoped you'd come. We've been preparing for this moment for years. You gave us the virus. You gave us the pain. But we turned it into purpose." Mason raised his weapon. "Show yourself." "You still don't understand," the voice continued. "We're not the monsters anymore. You are. You watched the world burn and left the wounded behind." A loud clang echoed through the tunnel. "They're here," Arlo said. A shape moved in the dark, quick, deliberate. Mason yelled, "Move." The tunnel exploded into chaos. Smoke bombs filled the air. Red lights blinked to life along the walls. As the team scrambled out the side exit, Mason caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the control room, watching them through a cracked window. Tall. Still. Wearing a scorched military jacket with a CDC tag. He didn't chase them. He just saluted. Again. They returned to Whitlow empty-handed. But one thing was clear. The undead weren't hiding anymore. They were organizing. Whitlow stood on edge. The gates were sealed. Spotlights swept across the fog every 15 seconds. Snipers were posted on every rooftop. Mason's breath fogged in the cold night air as he paced the upper wall, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line to the east. They hadn't attacked yet. That's what made it worse. "They're waiting for something," he said. Beside him, Elena scanned the distance through a pair of thermal binoculars. "They're out there. At least 50, spread thin. Just watching." Mason clenched his jaw. They want us to crack first. Since returning from Site R-17, word of the new threat had spread despite the Council's best efforts. Fear had a smell to it. And now, it hung over Whitlow like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant echo, sent people scrambling. Rumors swirled about the saluting figure in the jacket, the voice in the tunnel, the severed arm in the well. And then, without warning, the siege began. It started with silence. All power inside the town suddenly cut. Lights blinked out. Communications died. The backup generators didn't kick in. Mason ran to the command post, barking orders. Manual override. Get every lantern we have lit now. No one goes alone. No one splits off. They cut the lines, Arlo said, flashlight bouncing as he arrived. Main relay station was sabotaged. From the inside. That was the moment they realized someone among them wasn't on their side. Then came the sound. A deep, rhythmic thud from beyond the wall. Boom. 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 Not fists. Not weapons. Drums. They're signaling, Elena said, her face drained of color. It was true. The undead weren't just communicating. They were coordinating. The first wave hit at 2:43 a.m. Dozens of figures charged from the mist, not stumbling, moaning things, but silent predators, running in formation. Their limbs bent unnaturally, their eyes glowing like coals. They didn't claw at the gates. They climbed them. Hooked limbs into cracks. Used tools, scrap metal, broken blades, stone-tipped spears. Mason shouted orders from the tower. Focus fire on the climbers. Stay sharp. Arlo fired down into the fog, dropping 2 of them before they reached the wall. But more kept coming. For every one that fell, 2 more replaced it. They were tireless. Fast. Terrifyingly precise. They're not attacking like zombies, June said as she rigged explosives along the southern barrier. They're attacking like soldiers. Inside Whitlow, chaos erupted. A building near the market square went up in flames, an explosion from the inside. Saboteurs. Infected ones who looked just human enough to blend in until the time was right. Children screamed. Alarms blared, then fell silent as the backup batteries drained. Mason rushed to the gates with Jared and Elena. The wall was holding, for now, but barely. Pitched battles broke out as mutated undead flung themselves over the top, using human shields taken from earlier raids. Their cruelty wasn't random. It was psychological warfare. And it was working. Fall back to the inner defenses. Mason ordered. Evacuate the East Quarter. Dr. Harrow's voice came over the radio, shaky but urgent. I found something in the files. They called the leader Subject 0. The first one they experimented on. The one who adapted faster than all the others. The one in the jacket, Elena said. Harrow continued, he was a decorated soldier. Volunteered for experimental immunity trials. But the virus didn't kill him, it rewired him. And now, he's leading them. That name burned into Mason's memory. Subject 0. The one who remembered. Suddenly, through the swirling fog, a deep, commanding voice echoed across the battlefield. Mason Trask. This is justice. It came not from a speaker. Not from a recording. From a throat. A living voice in a dead body. And every creature outside stopped. Still. Listening. Waiting. I was your brother once, the voice said. We served the same flag. And when I begged you not to leave us in that bunker, you did. Mason felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be. Captain Elias Ward. He had been declared Kia 6 years ago. During the first major outbreak containment collapse. Mason had been there. He had followed orders and sealed the facility. He never saw Ward again. Until now. Mason stepped forward, voice hoarse. Elias. You let the world call us monsters, the voice answered from beyond the fog. So now, we become what you feared. Then the second wave came. Explosives. Smoke screens. Molotovs hurled from the woods. But this time, they weren't aiming to destroy. They were hurting. Driving survivors toward a weak point in the southern wall. Toward something unseen. Mason turned to Elena. They're not trying to kill us all tonight. She nodded grimly. They're trying to get inside. Smoke choked the southern corridor as survivors scrambled through alleyways, dragging wounded and shielding children. Mason's boots pounded the dirt as he raced to the breach point, heart hammering harder than it had in any battle before. The enemy wasn't mindless anymore. They were methodical. And they had found Whitlow's weakest wall. Elena, status. Mason barked into the radio. Static. Only static. He cursed and pushed through the fire-scorched passage near the grain depot, weapon raised. The southern wall, the one they never reinforced, thinking the hills made it impenetrable, was now wide open. A section had been blown inward, not clawed through. Explosives. Strategically placed. Mason slid to a stop behind cover and peered through the flames. They were coming. A wall of shadowed forms moved toward the breach, silent, fast, coordinated. Unlike the first wave, these carried shields fashioned from salvaged metal and wore fragments of riot gear from long-forgotten police units. Some even had helmets. This wasn't a horde. This was an army. Mason opened fire. So did Arlo from the rooftops, June from the barricades, and every defender left standing. Bullets flew. Fire raged. But the creatures advanced like they didn't feel pain, weaving between cover, flanking positions, overwhelming gun nests with terrifying speed. In the middle of it all stood Subject Zero, Elias Ward, unmoving, watching, commanding. Mason's rounds found no weakness. The ones that fell were replaced instantly. The line broke, then broke again. We have to pull back to the core, Mason shouted to June. Fallback signal, now! She nodded, blood on her forehead, and yanked the emergency flare. A bright blue flash lit the sky. Retreat. All remaining units began withdrawing toward the heart of Whitlow, City Hall, the final stronghold. Thick concrete, steel doors, an old generator below ground. It wasn't built for war, but it was better than nothing. As Mason helped drag a wounded scout to safety, he looked back one last time. He saw children's drawings burning against a wall. A stuffed animal in the dirt. The home they had rebuilt was collapsing. And the dead were walking its streets again. Inside City Hall, chaos. Families crammed into hallways. Lights flickered. Dr. Harrow was tending to the wounded, whispering to himself between stitches. Elena was at the center, managing resources, rerouting survivors, and keeping panic from breaking open. We've sealed the lower levels, she said when Mason reached her. But we can't hold this place forever. How many made it in? 87. Maybe less. We've lost contact with 3 districts. Mason looked around. These weren't soldiers. These were farmers, mechanics, teachers. And yet, they were all that remained between the undead and total collapse. We need to buy time, he said. Give June enough to wire the outer halls with traps. Elena hesitated. You're thinking of going back out there. I know Elias. Or whatever's left of him. He won't wait. He'll push through the moment he thinks we're scared. I need to show him we're not done yet. She nodded, then reached into her coat. A worn photo. For soldiers, arms around each other. Young, proud, grinning. Mason. Elias. 2 others now long dead. He still remembers this, she said. He remembers being human. Mason stared at it for a moment, then tucked it into his pocket. I'm counting on it. Outside, the town was lost. The streets were overrun, but not destroyed. Fires had been extinguished. The creatures moved with purpose, not chaos. They gathered weapons, tore down barriers, herded prisoners toward the town center. Some of the fallen had been taken, not eaten, not torn apart, captured. Elias stood in the square, staring up at the city hall building. "I know you're watching, Mason," he said aloud. No growl. No hiss. Just calm, chilling resolve. Inside, Mason was watching. And then he did something no one expected. He opened the front doors. Smoke poured in. So did silence. And Mason stepped out. Alone. Weapon lowered. "Elias," he called. "You remember me." "Good. Then you remember what we fought for." The figure stepped forward. The flesh on his face was pale, tight over bone, but his eyes, golden, glowing, held something more than rage. Recognition. "You left me," Elias said. "I followed orders," Mason replied. "But I never forgot." He took out the photo. Held it up. "We were brothers. And you can still end this." For a moment, Elias didn't move. The army behind him stood frozen, waiting. Then Elias reached out. And crushed the photo in his hand. "That man is gone." The signal was given. The horde surged forward. But before they could reach Mason, a series of massive explosions shook the square. June's traps. Shrapnel flew. Fires erupted. Smoke blinded everything. Mason ducked back inside, slamming the doors. "They're coming," he said. Elena nodded, already holding a rifle. "Then let's make it count." Part 8 title suggestion, The Last Stand. The barricades trembled. Each impact was a thunderclap, each breath a countdown. Inside the fortified halls of City Hall, Whitlow's last survivors braced for the end. Dust rained from the ceiling. Children clutched their parents. Guns were loaded with shaking hands. The undead were at the gates, and this time, they would not stop. Mason stood at the center, flanked by Elena, June, and Arlo, faces bloodied, exhausted, unbroken. "They breached that door," June said. "It's over." Mason shook his head. "Not over. Never over." He looked at Elena, who nodded, sliding a small device into his palm. The detonator. One last option if the walls fell. A buried explosive rigged under the main hall, meant to collapse the entrance and trap anything inside, including them. "It's a last resort," she said softly. Mason looked around at the people, the frightened, the wounded, the brave, and tightened his grip on the detonator. "We fight before we fall." The first breach came at 3:12 a.m. The southern stairwell gave out under pressure, and the mutated undead poured in like floodwater. But the defenders were ready. Flame traps ignited. Gunfire roared. Arrows flew. Mason and June led the front, moving like ghosts through the smoke, every step a strike, every breath a battle. "They're inside the east wing," someone shouted. Mason turned. "Arlo, with me." They moved fast, navigating narrow corridors littered with broken furniture and smoldering debris. Around a corner, they found two creatures dragging a screaming boy. Without hesitation, Arlo dropped both with precise headshots. The boy ran to safety. It felt like hours, but only minutes passed. Then came the worst of it. The final wave. The creatures stopped attacking randomly. They pushed toward the center. Toward the survivors. Toward Mason. He knew why. Elias. Through the fire, the smoke, the madness, he stepped forward. Tall, armored in pieces of human gear. A nightmare reborn. But the eyes, they still held something. Not kindness. Not mercy. Memory. "Mason," Elias said, voice deep and calm despite the carnage around him. "Elena, take the others to the vault," Mason said, stepping forward alone. "Seal it. No matter what." She grabbed his arm. "You'll die." "I know." He turned to Elias. "You want me?" You came for me. So let's end this. Just us. For a moment, even the infected seemed to pause. Elias raised one decayed hand and motioned for his soldiers to stand down. Mason dropped his rifle. They met in the middle of the grand chamber, between broken statues and shattered windows, once symbols of government and hope, now ruins. You should have saved us, Elias said. You should have stayed human, Mason replied. With a roar, Elias charged. They collided like titans. Fists cracked bone. Elbows split flesh. Mason fought with everything, training, rage, guilt. But Elias was faster, stronger, built from pain and engineered evolution. Still, Mason refused to fall. He struck Elias across the jaw, then jammed a flare into his side. The creature screamed, twisting away in agony, smoke pouring from the wound. I didn't forget you, Mason growled. You forgot yourself. But Elias recovered quickly. He grabbed Mason by the throat, lifting him from the ground. Your time is over. Then came a shout. Elena. She appeared at the top of the chamber, rifle in hand, aim true. One shot. Straight into Elias's exposed side. The creature staggered. Just enough. Mason pulled the pin from the final flare grenade on his belt and shoved it into Elias's chest. He kicked off, diving behind a pillar. The explosion rocked the room. When the dust cleared, Elias lay still, smoldering. Half his face gone. His chest caved in. But he still breathed. Barely. Mason limped toward him. Elias blinked, blood trailing from what remained of his lips. I remember, he rasped. I do too, Mason said. He knelt, closing Elias's eyes. The hall was silent. The infected stopped. As if the connection had broken. Some screamed in confusion. Others fled. A few stood still, twitching, without command. Then the defenders struck. They swept the building, driving out the scattered remnants. Whitlow would never be the same. But it would survive. Later that morning, with the first rays of sunlight piercing through the fog, the survivors emerged into what was left of their town. Burned. Broken. But theirs. Elena stood beside Mason at the edge of the square. Is it over? She asked. Mason shook his head. Not over. But we've taken back the ground we lost. And now, they know we're not giving it up again. What happens next? He looked out at the rising sun. We rebuild. Smarter. Stronger. And this time, we don't forget what we saw. From the rubble, children drew new chalk lines on the concrete, this time not for games, but for defenses. Whitlow had stood its last stand. N1. White heavy checkmark completed, 8-part story finished.